Hello Tool School fans, I'm Katrina Walker, Tool School instructor, and for today's Tool School Live, we're going to be looking at beading bracelets with the bracelet maker. Now I'm just going to take a quick check at my screen. It looks like we're good to go, but again, if you're just tuning in, hello. I know it's right at the top of the hour, but I'm Katrina Walker and I'm the Tool School instructor for Clover. And the featured tool for this Tool School Live will be the bracelet maker. And in this case, the bracelet maker, we're going to be working with beads. Now, I'm primarily a sewist, but I really love having the chance to explore all these other great tools that are kind of more on the crafting side of things. And of course, who doesn't love beads, right? Everybody loves beads. And so when I found out that the bracelet maker allowed you not only to work with all different kinds of threads and yarns and things to make, more kind of your traditional friendship bracelet type of bracelet, but that you could actually work beads into it, I was super excited. And I think you'll be excited too. So I decided to go ahead and incorporate that into this live for you to see how it's done. I'm just going to show you a couple of different techniques today. I'm going to be showing you how to use beads with a square knot technique and how to use beads with a ladder stitch technique. So that's just two. Now there's so many different ways that you can use different techniques with the bracelet maker, and also of course use beads with it as well. So let me just put my glasses on, and I'm going to be checking the screen, make sure that I'm not missing out on any chat questions that you might have. So anyway, so if you have any questions, just feel free to pop them up there. But otherwise, let's get going. Now, let me show you what the bracelet maker looks like to begin with, okay? So the bracelet maker comes in this lovely box. And as you can even see from the illustration here, there's a lot of different ways that you can use it to make tools. Now, this is what the actual bracelet maker looks like. And the bracelet maker is basically a loom. So it's a very simple loom. We have two adjustment screws with the bracelet maker. And this allows us to actually make it longer or narrower depending on, say, the circumference of the wrist that you're making the bracelet for. You could actually also put longer threads or yarns on your warp, and you could potentially move down your weaving or what have you as you go and make it even longer. So you have a lot of flexibility with it. And there's also two different ways, which you're going to see, that you can warp your little bracelet maker loom. And that is, you have these guides here on the top. And again, I'll show you this again later as well, but these guides here, or there's this hole here. Two different ways to warp your threads or yarns for actually making your bracelets. All right, so it's really a cool tool. It also comes with a couple of shuttles that you'll see me using to do my square knots. And these just help you to organize your yarns if you're doing weaving or knotting or braiding or what have you. It's nice to have these shuttles just to wind your threads around them and keep everything all organized. Okay, so I'm actually going to start off with today showing you how to do a square knot woven bracelet. Now I'm actually going to put this on my close-up here. So this is a square knot bracelet. So you knot the beads into the bracelet as you go using a square knot. Now I'll confess, I am not the world's greatest knotter, so to speak, and so it's not unusual for me to have a little bit of a challenge, but if I can do it, you can do it. So I thought I would demonstrate this. Now, the kind of beads you're going to want for your square knot style bracelet is you're going to want slightly larger beads. So beads with a fairly large hole. This is the size I'm using. So the hole is fairly good sized, and it needs to be because when we go ahead and warp up the bracelet maker, so again, the bracelet maker is basically a loom here. So when we go ahead and warp that, you're going to be using a couple of strands, and I'm using regular embroidery floss. So Again, with the bracelet maker, you can use a lot of different styles of lightweight yarns or thread, but most commonly, and the easiest to get lots of great colors, is simply to use embroidery floss. So I'm using 2 strands of embroidery floss, so I had to make sure that whatever bead I was using had a large enough hole that it could be threaded onto the embroidery floss. So when we do the square knot technique, we have the ability to go ahead and we put the beads onto our warp, which is our threads here, before we do our knotting. So you preload the beads, and I found for a bracelet, these larger beads, for the number of knots that I'm creating, I found that about 20 beads worked really well. So somewhere between 20, 25 beads, just depending on how many knots in between each bead. You can always measure the beads and then measure your wrist, figure out the difference, and then figure out how many knots it takes in between to make it all add up. But I'll just tell you that if you use 4 or 5 knots in between, that 20 beads seems to be a good number. So again, just to kind of refresh I'm going to put this on the other slightly larger overhead. So with our beading bracelet maker, sorry, it is morning here in the Pacific Northwest. On your bracelet maker, we go ahead and we set it up. Now, if you need to make it longer, you do. But we take our embroidery floss. Now I have started to knot, so my shuttles are kind of attached here. But we just take a couple of strands of our embroidery floss and we go through this hole in the center. And we use these screws on the end of the bracelet maker. We loosen these up. You wrap the excess floss around the nut and then you tighten it up. And that's what keeps your warp yarn here. Keeps it nice and taut. So it makes it easy to work with, easy to knot. And of course, you're going to do this on both ends. So that's how you get this set up to start with. Now I've gone ahead and put my beads on my bracelet maker because watching me do that is kind of like watching paint dry, not the most exciting thing you can do. So I went ahead and did that and got a few knots going. Let's go ahead and go back to our close-up so you can see what's going on. All right, so again, this is going to be, what I'm working on is the square knot version of how to make a beaded bracelet with the bracelet maker. So the square knot is very simple, and see how it creates a kind of a color pattern as we go. And the key is to be consistent. And here's a previous one I did with basically the same types of embroidery floss and the same beads. To give you an idea where we're going with this. All right, so here we go. I'm just going to make sure, double check my chat window here. I'm going to make sure I'm not missing anything if anyone asks any questions. Okay, so feel free to do that if you should so choose. Let me just straighten out my floss, because I can get kind of messy that way. All right, how to do a square knot to create a square knot beaded bracelet with the bracelet maker. Yeah, Clover's bracelet maker really is just an amazing tool. So this is my dark green floss. You can see basically it was on the left. So when you thread this up, you're going to basically have a left and a right bobbin, or we'll call it a bobbin right now because my brain just went completely blank. But you're going to tie on the floss that you're using for knotting. You're going to tie it onto your warp. And I've just pulled the extra floss through the hole here, and just to keep them out of the way. Okay, I could have tied it around one of these screws, but I'm just going to leave them there. I just want them out of the way. So anyhow, so one is on the left, one is on the right, and we're going to start with crossing the shuttle, or you can call it a bobbin if you want to, but crossing the shuttle over the top. So this is laying on top of your warp yarn or your warp threads. All right, and then I'm going to take my other shuttle and I'm going to make sure that I kind of cross over, but I'm coming up under the yarn. And I'm just going to gently give it a pull to straighten it out. Do you see how that looks like two interlocking half circles? That's how I know that I formed my stitch or my knot correctly. All right, now my dark green is over on the right, so I'm going to cross it over. And again, I'm just going to lay it over on top of, basically laying on top of my warp. And then see how I'm taking this shuttle, I'm going in front of it, or toward the back side of the shuttle, but then I'm making sure to come underneath that yarn, underneath that floss. I know I keep using that interchangeably. I hope that doesn't drive you crazy, but just depends on what you're working with. But you saw how it was like two interlocking half circles. Okay, so that is 2 knots now. Well, 1 full knot. I'm going to count that as 1 full knot past my bead. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create a few more knots. So my pattern is I'm doing 5 knots in between the beads. So again, I take that left shuttle and I lay it over the top. I take my other shuttle, come up underneath and through. And when I gently pull, I should have those interlocking half circles. Come from the right. I know mine, it wants to curl up this morning. I'm not sure why, but doesn't really matter. We'll just get it going here. And we're just going to repeat this pattern, left and right. And just keep forming those half circles. And I know that it's a complete knot when my dark shuttle is over on the left again. And so you see how we're creating these. There's basically the dark thread, or the dark floss, see, is coming up the center, and then the lighter floss is on the edges. So it creates a really pretty pattern. So the thread or the yarn, depending on what you're using, that starts on the left that we're always crossing over, basically ends up in the middle. So bear this in mind, you know, when you're deciding what colors to use and how you want your pattern to look. So in this case, because I'm always crossing the darker floss, I'm always putting that one on top of the warp. It's the color that's running up the middle of my bracelet, not the edges of my bracelet. Okay, so let's count. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. I believe that's 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. No, actually, I'm not going to count this one that's right here next to my bead because that's going to be nuts. I'm going to do one more. So again, just crossing over. I had to do a little warm-up exercise this morning because, again, knots are a funny thing for me. They don't always click. Okay, so there's my design. Now I'm going to go up here where I've strung the beads. So again, when you do the knotted style bracelets with beads, you need to make sure to pre-string the beads. So you also have to find a needle that you can put strands of your embroidery floss through. Now I actually used a smallish sashiko needle because sashiko needles are designed to work with heavy threads. So, and I had to thread it one piece of floss at a time, but it is doable. Now, theoretically, it would be possible to potentially thread these on another strand and just run it up the center of this, and just as long as you get it all knotted in there. But it's best if you can put these, it's most secure if you can put these on the warp. All right, so I'm just going to grab the next bead, and I'm going to just slide it into place. And once I've slid it into place, it's just a matter of going back to my knotting. So laying the left shuttle over, and bringing the right one through. And then laying that same dark green, which is now on the right, over. And then pulling it through. So again, I'm not counting that knot as part of my pattern. Okay, so technically it's more like 6 knots in between. But I also decreased this by 1 bead. I did 21 beads my last bracelet, so a little bit more probably won't hurt. You can always, it's better to put too many beads on because you can always just take any excess beads off the warp when you finish your bracelet. So better to have too many than too few. Okay, so err on the side of caution. Again, I find that somewhere between 20 and 25 of these large beads works nicely to create a nice pattern. But it's really up to you. You could have a bead every other knot if you wanted to. It's completely up to you. You are the designer. You could only have beads in the middle if you wanted, or you could just have one big bead in the middle. So what's really great is that Clover has actually, not only have they designed this awesome bracelet maker, but I'll show you in just a moment, they have really great instructions. Again, knotting is not my forte, no pun intended, of course, there. So if I can do it, you could do it. Totally. And just show you, so not only does it come with excellent instructions on how to warp all this up, but more importantly, there's QR codes here. And on these QR codes, if you scan those in, it will take you right to a wonderful, wonderful educational PDF. Now, I printed mine out on huge paper. You don't have to do that. You can print this on normal paper, but I have a big printer, so I put it on big paper for myself. But you can print this off, and it will show you how to make knotted bracelets, a whole bunch of different styles of, well, let's see, at least 6 different styles of knots. It'll show you how to weave. It'll show you how to do ladder stitching. It'll show you how to do braiding. I think they tell you there's like 8 different ways to do this, but I can honestly say that, let's see, there's 6 knots. There's weaving, which is pretty basic, but you can do a lot of different ways. There's at least 10 different ways you can do bracelets just based on this. And there's infinite numbers of variety of how you can do variations of this. So anyhow, be sure to scan in when you get your bracelet maker inside the box. So when you get your bracelet maker, inside the box with your loom and your shuttles is, of course, your detailed instructions. And make sure to scan in those QR codes to go get your detailed handout with all those different ways to make your bracelets. It's really fabulous. So anyhow, so let's go ahead and learn how to do beaded bracelets another way. So there's another way to do it. So I've been showing you how to do beaded bracelets using the square knot technique. Let's go and learn how to do it using the ladder stitch. So ladder stitch is a beading stitch. And I'm going to go ahead and I will be showing you that a little bit more live. So I did cheat a little bit, and I had my warp already set up and my beads on there for my knotted sample because, well, frankly, I'm not real quick at getting it set up. So I didn't want you to have to sit through that. But I'll show you how to get the ladder stitch started. I'm a little bit more proficient as a beader. That doesn't mean, of course, that I'll be all thumbs or not this morning, but should be a little bit more easier to follow. Okay, so this is one of those whereas on when you do the knotted version, you see how the warp is going through this center hole. All right, but when you do weaving, When you do weaving or I'm going to be doing this ladder stitch technique, you warp it using this upper area that has these notches. Okay, so these notches allow you to space your warp yarns or threads however you want them. I've spaced these a little bit further apart than I might normally do just because I wanted it to be easy to see what I was doing with my beads. All right, so for the ladder stitch, rather than stringing the beads onto my warp, I'm going to be stitching them on with beading thread as I go. So the first thing I need to do is so I have my beading needle. Actually, I'm not using a beading needle, I'm using an applique needle, but use your needle. I had a hard time getting my beading needle threaded, so I said, I'll just use an applique needle. But anyhow, with your beading thread, you want to make sure that you leave a fairly long tail at the beginning. I'm just going to tie a simple knot here. You leave a long tail because you're going to want to be able to thread that up through your beads when all is said and done to hide it. All right, so ideally, no one will be able to find the knot where you started stitching your beads on. So you just want to leave a reasonably long tail, so that long enough that you could thread a needle onto it and hide it inside your beads when all is said and done. Okay, so let me just finish tying this very simple knot to secure it to one of the warp threads here. All right, you also want to work with a fairly long strand of beading thread. Now, this can get tricky because it can tangle. I didn't iron this, but sometimes it helps to wax and iron your threads. It just depends. A lot of beading threads are actually pre-waxed, so you don't need to do that. But anyhow, you want to work with a fairly long strand just so that hopefully you don't run out of beading thread before you get to the end of your bracelet, because then you'll have to hide another knot and so on. It's not the end of the world. It's just slightly annoying. All right, so I'm going to pick up how this starts. I'm going to pick up a bead. And I would have gone over, under, but this is the first bead, so I just have to get started. I'm just going to hold the bead with my finger, and I'm going to hopefully try to make it so you can see it easily. But the key here is we're basically weaving. So I went over, at least I think I did. Did I go over, under? Nope, I went under. Okay. So I end up going under the warp yarn. It doesn't really matter. Let's put that bead back in there. But whether I went over or under, I have to make sure go in the opposite direction coming back. So over there, so that means I'm going to go under here. And with this being my first bead, I'm going to be a little extra cautious. I'm actually going to go through again. So over, under, just to make sure it's securely on there. I don't want it just half fastened in place. Let me just readjust my focus here too, make sure that you can really see. Okay, I'm going to darken up my exposure too. There we go. Okay, so and then over, under again. Just bear with me a moment. There we go. Okay. So I went through this bead twice just to make sure everything's nice and secure. I'm just going to try to get my tail out of the way there. All right. So over, under, over. Okay. So I need to make sure now I see my thread is over my warp, so I'm going to pull that down. I should have exited underneath, so I'm just going to make sure that it's goes under. All right. Now I'm ready to grab my next bead. So the pattern I've established is over, under. Just set that bead down in there. And I'm just going to kind of support it with my finger to keep it in place. Now I go over, under. Oops, get in there. See how my thread wants to get tangled? Just watch that. What I'll do is I'll put my finger in the thread just to kind of keep it taut, keep it from tangling. All right, and just gently snug it up into place. So now I'm ready to go. Let's see, did I end up over, under? So this is where you have to kind of watch it. It's easy to come out accidentally. If the pattern is to go under, yep, it looks like that thread is on top, so you just have to watch yourself. Now it looks like I've looped around, but that's okay. It's not going to harm anything. All right, next bead. Over, under. If you use, you can see that I'm using a beading thread that very closely matches my warp threads. Get in there. And that really helps, because if you're a little bit off or a little messy at the beginning, sorry, I'm just going to try focusing this one more time. Okay, hopefully that's a little better. Maybe it's the shine of the beads, but anyhow, you just want to make sure, just make sure I'm under. There we go. If you, again, if you use a matching thread, it really helps to disguise any irregularities. So this is what we call, again, this is a ladder stitch. So you warp your, whoops, caught my thread on my loom. Just loosen that up. You caught around the, there we go. Caught around the tension knobs there. Whoops, get in there. Okay. So we're just stitching, literally stitching the beads onto our warp yarns. It's very, very simple. So I came out underneath, so let's grab the next bead. So over, under, and it's just kind of a figure eight. If you just think of it as a figure eight, if it seems a little difficult to understand, it's a basic figure eight kind of configuration. So I went over, under, now I have to go over, under. And we're just going to continue this, adding a bead each time. And by the way, you can use, now I'm just using the same beads I used for my square knot example, but you can use, you probably figure this out for yourself, but you really can use whatever style of bead you want. It doesn't have to be these great big beads. They can be little bitty beads. Oops. So I made a mistake there. I'm going to drop that bead out. No big deal. Oh, I see. I accidentally went. Looks like I accidentally went over instead of under. No big deal. Just get myself straightened out here. See, it's very forgiving. No big deal. But again, you just make sure that you just add a bead every time. But you can use, again, not to get sidetracked, but you really can use any size bead you want. These are just big, so they're easy to see. And they go really fast because you're working with such big beads. And of course, I'm just working with with 2 yarns or 2 embroidery flosses. There, I wanted to pop out again, but we're just gonna, I know I did it right, so I'm just going to carefully tighten things up again here. Again, working with long amounts of beading thread can be a little challenging, but so can adding in another thread or knotting in another thread while you're in progress. So I would rather manage a longer strand of thread than have to re-knot, but you may feel differently, and that's fine. It's completely fine to do it the other way, where you just knot in additional beading thread as you need. That's purely a personal preference. I prefer just to use a long strand and just manage it carefully. Okay, I just got to make sure I go under. There we go. All right, so we just keep stitching. Now I also want to point out that you can, so like this is my earlier example I did when I was testing things out before. And this example, I used 3 strands. I'll put this on the close-up. So this is done with 3 strands of embroidery floss in my warp. And then, of course, that means you're stitching in. You have 2 gaps between the yarns. And so I'm stitching in 2 sets of beads. And it's still the same over, under, you know, kind of like a figure 8, but over, under. It's just, you're just weaving through more objects. But it's the same exact technique. And you have on your loom, let's see, we have, let's see, how many notches do we have here? 1. So each gap, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you could technically have up to 7 threads or floss or yarn, whatever you want to use. You could actually have up to 7, which means you could have, is it 5 beads in between there? So you can do quite a bit of things with it. And you can also, if you're doing weaving, of course, you could have 7 threads, yarns, floss, whatever, warped up to do weaving as well. So you really have, again, not only do they show you in Clover's instructions how to do 10 different techniques, at least, you have so many variations in terms of how many you can do. So again, I'm just demonstrating a single row with just, you know, of beads with just 2 rows of floss. This is 2 rows of beads with 3 strands of floss, and you know, you can obviously change that however you wish. So let me just go through this. People who are just stopping by, go ahead and show you just a few more stitches, and then I'll go back and demonstrate a couple more knots on my square knot example for your viewing pleasure and just to get caught up. So again, this is the ladder stitch technique. It just consists of an over, under figure 8 style configuration. So my thread is underneath, or should be underneath. It's hard to tell. The embroidery floss, whoops. Oh, here's another one. We'll just pick that one up. I'm alternating between darker and lighter beads. I should have made it easy and just done the same bead, but you know how it goes. So you just want to be always doing an over-under style stitch. So I need to come out underneath. There we go. So just watch that embroidery, watch the beading thread. A little tongue-tied this morning. But the beading thread will potentially get tangled, but it's usually waxed, which helps a lot. And you can always wax it yourself if you need to. If you wax thread, make sure to go ahead and give it a light press, believe it or not, with a warm iron. It doesn't have to be a hot iron, just a warm iron. And that will actually melt melt the wax into the thread and helps it behave better. Helps keep it from knotting. A lot of people, they know about waxing it. They don't realize that you're supposed to actually press the wax into the thread. All right, so again, this is the ladder stitch. And it just consists of stitching over, under, basically a figure 8, stitching the beads onto your bracelet maker warp yarns. All right, I'm just going to do this bead and then I'm going to move on to the square knot. Just a quick review of that. And of course, answer any questions you might have. All right, so it's really that easy. We just keep stitching along and pretty soon, not much time at all, we have a beautiful bracelet. And I really look forward to experimenting with this more. It's so much fun and you can just do a lot with it. But okay, let's switch over to, go back to the square knot example. And of course with the square knot, it's different in that the square knot, you go ahead and you string the beads on first. You string the beads on first, and then we knot them into place using a square knot. Now this is the design I've created. You decide how many knots that you want to create in between each bead. Now I have a knot here, but I have one full knot since putting that bead in place. And my personal design is to have, there's a knot, of course, that holds the bead in place, but my personal design is to have 5 full sets between beads. So I'm just straightening out my floss here. So my floss has been wound onto these handy shuttles. People think of these for weaving, and they are, but they're also very helpful for knotting and other things. If you've worked with embroidery floss before, you've probably seen shuttles. Okay, actually let's get up a little bit here. And refocus. There we go. Okay, so just as a review, how to do the square knot. So when I'm starting out here, basically my shuttle, I have a shuttle on each side. Now I have a darker green on the left, a lighter green on the right. So the pattern I've been using is to take the dark green and it crosses over and lays on top of my warp yarns. All right, then the lighter green comes in underneath the warp yarn. And when I just gently start to pull on this, you'll see this formation that looks like 2 semicircles. And that's how it's supposed to look. And you'll see how using this, where I'm always putting, so the next half, that's half of my square knot, then I'm going to lay that dark green on top again, this time coming from the right. And I'm going to pull the lighter green in again, and again gently pull it again. There's my formation of those 2 half circles. And using it this way, we create an effect where we have the lighter green is on the outside, and you see how the dark green runs up the center. So it creates kind of a pattern. So again, think about this when you choose your yarns and figure out how you're going to do this. So I'll just do a couple more knots here. I'll try to move a little faster so you can see how the beads go in place. Because I know that's not always obvious to everyone. And that's okay. That's what's called learning. We aren't just born, we're not birds. We're not born knowing everything we need to know, or is it spiders? I don't know. At any rate, we don't know it all. We might think we do, but we don't. So we have to learn things as humans. So that's perfectly okay to not get it right away. But again, you know it's right if it looks like this, kind of couple half circles. So let's see, how many knots do we have? Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I think when this is done, I just have one more. The one advantage of working with 2 different colors is that it makes it a little easier to tell whether you've completed a knot or if you're only halfway through. And what I mean by that is that I know that I've completed a knot when my darker green is back over on the left-hand side of my bracelet maker loom. So now I can cut my, or excuse me, I can count these again. Let's see. I think I have one more. It looks like I'm one short. So again, I'm just going to lay that darker green on top of the loom. And I'm going to come up from underneath with the lighter green to form. Whoops, see, I did it wrong that time. It didn't form. See? So let's try that again. All right. So here's my darker green. I have to make sure that I'm doing it right. And twice in a row, I've just blown my knot. Okay, so here what was happening. My flosses weren't aligned, weren't laying correctly. So I have to make sure that this lighter green comes up and around the dark green. See, now it's forming correctly. So if that happens to you, just double check. Make sure that your other color is coming up and around before it goes underneath that one. That's an easy mistake to make. All right, so now that the stitches are in place, my knots are in place, I come up, I grab another bead and slide it on down into position. Okay, so it's just super easy. So whenever you want a bead, whatever your design is, you just go ahead and slide it down to position, and then you just keep knotting. Very simple. And there we have it. So I hope you've enjoyed this little tutorial on how to do beading with your Clover bracelet maker. So the Clover, boy, I'm tongue-tied today. The Clover bracelet maker loom really is just a ton of fun. They're great to have for just good for that rainy day, or if you got a bunch of kids around, or it's even good for adults because you can make some pretty darn fancy bracelets with it. I really want to try, warping up some really lightweight fine wire and then weaving or doing some ladder stitching with it. I don't know. I haven't quite decided on what I'm going to do yet because I could use some metallic thread too. I think metallic thread would be really pretty to do some bead weaving with that too. So the sky's the limit, really. So make sure that if you get your bracelet maker, make sure that when you open it up, of course you'll have your loom in there, you'll have your shuttles, but remember that you also have these great detailed instructions, and be sure to go and open it up and scan that QR code and get your instructions for how to do all these fabulous different designs, of which I've only shown you 2 that you can do. So anyhow, I don't see any questions, so I'm sure that there will be some down the road. But thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Katrina Walker, and on behalf of Clover, thank you for attending Tool School. And I will see you later.